Matthew Henson's Story by Kenneth Neal Parker. Commander Robert E. Peary, Arctic Explorer. Robert Peary had a dream. This is the story of how Matthew Henson helped Commander Robert E. Peary make his dream come true. Together, the two men were among the first people known to travel to the North Pole. Matthew was an American man who spent many years working for Commander Peary. After taking Matthew Henson on 7 journeys north, Peary knew he could trust him. He knew Matthew was the one man he wanted around when he finally reached the North Pole. When they returned, Matthew Henson wrote about his life. In this book, we will use Matthew's own words, whenever we can, to tell his story. Matthew's Story. Matthew Henson was born in Maryland in 1866. During that time, many African Americans had little chance to go to school. However, Matthew went to school for 6 years. He studied hard, but he did not want to learn about the world only from books. He wanted to see the world himself. To make this happen, Matthew began working as a cabin boy on a ship sailing to China. As a teenager, he sailed all over the world, working his way up from cabin boy to sailor. Matthew first met Robert Peary when Matthew was 18 years old. At that time, he was working at a fur shop in Washington, D.C. One day, Commander Peary came into the shop. He needed to store some furs until his next journey. Before he was 18, Matthew Henson had traveled around the world. Matthew Henson, along with 3 other members of the team on his first visit to the Arctic, 1891. The two men began to talk, and they soon discovered that they both loved travel and adventure. Matthew was impressed with the U.S. Navy commander. Matthew wanted to work for him. Peary also was impressed with Matthew Henson. Before much time passed, Matthew was working for Commander Robert E. Peary as his assistant. Matthew's first trip with the commander was to Nicaragua, a warm country in Central America. Then in 1891, when he was 24 years old, Matthew took his first trip to the cold Arctic regions. For weeks and weeks, across seemingly never-ending wastes of the ice cap of North Greenland, I marched with Peary, he complained. He did not enjoy the cold temperatures or the howling wind. He promised himself to never again leave my happy home in warmer lands. Peary's ship was named in honor of President Theodore Roosevelt. By the next year, Matthew had changed his mind about traveling north. He went to the Arctic with Peary again. Later, Matthew proudly wrote, "I have been a member of every expedition of his, in the capacity of assistant." Peary and Henson went to the Arctic together 7 times. Each time they learned more and pushed farther north. Finally, in 1908, Peary decided that they were ready to fulfill their dreams by making it all the way to the North Pole. Henson supported his plan. They would sail in a ship designed to withstand icebergs. It was called the Roosevelt, in honor of President Theodore Roosevelt. Matthew Henson helped to prepare the ship. He made sure Peary had all of the supplies and crew that he would need for the long journey. Then the big day came. Matthew wrote, "July 6th, 1908. We're off. For a year and a half I have waited for this order.
and now we have cast off.
Aboard the ship called the Roosevelt, Commander Peary, Matthew Henson, and the others sailed north to the Arctic. They sailed from New York, heading for Greenland. Some of the crew had invited guests on board for the first part of the trip. At the port of Sydney, all of the guests, including Peary's wife and children, said goodbye and sailed back home. Matthew had no guests, and he felt lonely watching the fond farewells. He wrote, "My thoughts were with my wife, and I hoped that she would be glad she had permitted me to leave her for an absence that might never end." After leaving Sydney, the Roosevelt headed straight for Cape York in northern Greenland. It was a fine ship, able to dodge the icebergs in Baffin Bay. On the ship, Matthew spent much of his time fixing things with his carpenter's kit. He had more jobs to do when they got to Cape York. He wrote in his book, "For the last week I have been busy with, 'Matt, the commander wants you,' 'Matt, do this,' and 'Matt, do that,' and with going ashore and trading for skins, dogs, lines, and other things." Matthew Henson on the deck of the Roosevelt. Besides those jobs, Matthew hunted for walruses. Also, it was Matthew's job to choose Eskimos to join the expedition team. Matthew had lived among Eskimos and already had Eskimo friends. He wrote, "I have been with Eskimos for companions, speaking their language, dressing in the same kind of clothes, living in the same kind of dens, eating the same food, enjoying their pleasures, and frequently sharing their griefs. I have come to love these people." Matthew Henson with Eskimo members of the expedition. 4 members of the team pose on a sledge designed by Robert Peary and built by Matthew Henson. The Roosevelt took on more coal for fuel, and the expedition continued north. From this point, they would see no more towns. As Matthew wrote, "From now on it will be farewell to all the world. We will be alone with our company, and our efforts will be towards the north." On September 5, 1908, the Roosevelt reached Cape Sheridan, a point of land on the shore of the Arctic Ocean. The expedition built a camp and spent the winter at Cape Sheridan. Matthew had many jobs, such as training the dogs. He also had to build all the sledges. Matthew wrote that they were sledges of a different pattern from those used before, designed by Commander Peary, and I have done the work. In the far north, the darkness of night lasts the entire winter. Peary's expedition could not go any further north until the daylight returned. While they waited, Matthew felt the isolation of a dark, frozen world. He longed for the light to return. On February 18, 1909, Matthew wrote, "The Arctic night still holds sway, but today at noon, far to the south, a thin band of twilight shows, giving promise of the return of the sun. Each day, the sunlight returned, and the day got brighter. By March 1st, there was enough light to begin the trip toward the North Pole." Matthew drove the sledge that led the group. He wrote, "At about 6:30 in the morning, forward, march," and we were off. The team had to repair a sledge during the trip. The first night that they spent out on the ice was one of the coldest Matthew had ever felt. He did not get much sleep. To keep his fingers and toes from freezing, he had to make sure blood was flowing to them. All through the night I would wake up from the cold and beat my arms or feet to keep the circulation going. For the next 5 weeks, the expedition kept moving north. Sometimes the ice was flat and smooth. March 22nd was a clear, calm day. Matthew described how glad he was that morning. Stretching to the northward was a brilliantly illuminated, level, and slightly drifted snow plain, and we were truly grateful. At other times, ridges of ice as much as 60 feet high stood in their way. Often, the team had to unload the sledges and push their supplies over ridges of ice. Matthew Henson, center, stands on ice at the North Pole, with Okea, Utu, Igingwa, and Siglu from left to right. By the first week in April, the goal was near. The North Pole was only about 80 miles away. Matthew wrote, "Day and night were the same. My thoughts were on the going and getting forward, and on nothing else." On April 6, 1909, Matthew saw Commander Peary measuring the position of the sun. Later, he measured again at a place 4 miles away. When Peary returned, Matthew wrote, "The commander gave the word. We will plant the stars and stripes at the North Pole." And it was done. The glorious banner was unfurled in the breeze. Finally, the North Pole had been found, and Matthew Henson was there. Talk about it. 1. What were some of the things that made the trip to the North Pole difficult and dangerous? 2. What do you think it would be like to live in a place where the darkness lasts all winter? Write about it. 3. On a separate sheet of paper, make a list of skills and personal qualities that Matthew Henson showed during his travels. Use the list to write a letter to Commander Peary explaining why he should hire Matthew. Extend language. One meaning of the word off is from this place or away. Matthew Henson wrote, "We're off," to say that he and other people were leaving on a trip away from their camp. What did Henson mean when he wrote, "Forward, march," and we were off? What does it mean for a boat to go offshore?